In Europe, health care is subsidized by the government. So it is cheaper to buy weed in pharmacies in Germany than it is to buy it illicitly. So really think about that. In the US, it's always cheaper to buy your weed on the street. That allows us to ask more critical questions about how we're administering things. But as you said, insurance doesn't cover cannabis in the US. And so I think it is pretty wild that not only do you walk into a pharmacy, right, to buy your cannabis in Germany, but also you're likely buying it at a cheaper price than you would be able to buy it on the street because it's subsidized by the government.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cannabis Accounting Podcast. Today I have with me my friend Hirsh Jain, the founder of Ananda Strategies and alumni of both Berkeley and Harvard. And so I'll kick it over to yourself, Hirsh, to introduce yourself to anybody who doesn't quite know you yet.
Thanks, Raymond. Honestly, it's so awesome to be on the podcast. I really enjoy the podcast as a listener. You have so many interesting folks on. And so I feel like I already know the podcast really well, and it's awesome to join it as a guest. Raymond, as you mentioned, my name's Hirsh Jain. I run a consulting firm called Ananda Strategy. I've run it for about 6 years, although before that, I worked in cannabis in-house at a couple of big cannabis companies, and I'm sure we'll get into it. And basically, what my firm does, Raymond, is we're a business advisory firm, and we work with operators all across the supply chain. So retailers, brands, distributors, testing labs, all of the gamut of different actors in cannabis, including capital providers. And then what do we do for them? A variety of different things, Raymond, but I'll just enumerate some of them. Some of them is competitive licensing, right? So it's like helping retailers obtain the licenses they need to open up shop. Some of it is legislative strategy, right? Trying to impact laws that impact these clients, right? So if the state is going to impose a 10 milligram cap on beverages, right? Trying to impact that legislation. Some of it is regulatory intelligence, right? Just kind of being aware of different regulatory changes and how it'll impact your business. And then some of it is market expansion, right? Entering into other states, identifying the right business partners, determining how the retail landscape will unfold, trying to predict how pricing will evolve over time. And then, maybe one or two other things that I'll mention. Some of it is what I call strategic communication, right? So enabling these cannabis operators to tell their story in a way that is compelling and that can advance their business and partnership objectives. And it's a gamut of things, but I would say those are the main things that we do.
No, I appreciate you kind of breaking it down. And each one of those things I feel like could just be like a whole, topic podcast in and of itself. But just tell me a little bit around, just, back up a little bit, who is Hirsh? No, just kidding. But what's your background kind of before Ananda Strategy? Kind of like we were talking about, you were with McKinsey, you were with Airbnb, both very interesting companies for different reasons. Like we were talking off air. I like McKinsey from the consulting perspective, having worked for them, like for my old company where they came in and it was like a very unique learning question. It was almost like they just had the tenacity to just keep asking why from one project to the next. So I liked working with them because our projects never ended. So we could never get anything wrong. But they're awesome. And then management consulting, it's a unique topic, especially for anybody interested in business, because it's hard enough, but then there's these people that can consult on it. And then Airbnb, obviously a very unique business that, didn't really exist and kind of created a industry or a market and that's brand new. And I think we're kind of doing the same thing in cannabis. And so from that perspective, just what did you learn kind of just early days, kind of your background with McKinsey and Airbnb that you were able to bring into the cannabis industry, or even just, you could just talk a little bit about that one at a time. And really just like McKinsey, my question is like, how do consultants become management consultants when they're still so young and early in their career? Because in theory, this, manager of 20 years or whatever in this industry should know more than us coming in as consultants or yourself. So just tell me a little bit about your experience with McKinsey.
Totally. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about my story and background, and then I'll kind of get into McKinsey. I think the first thing worth noting about me, Raymond, is I grew up in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. So cannabis has been part of my life for a really long time. And so that just explains in part why I work in cannabis, like a lot of us, right? I've been passionate about the plant for a long time. And I just grew up in a part of the country where even 20 years ago, it was like much more normalized than other parts of the country. Raymond, I actually got arrested at my high school prom for cannabis. And so that's another big part of the story. I got very publicly,
comes out.
I got very publicly and embarrassingly arrested again at my high school prom about a week before I graduated from high school. And so that, was obviously very, very embarrassing for me. And it gave me an experience with how, the criminal justice system could negatively impact you. And, I got lucky, Raymond. I was still 17 years old at the time. And so that ended up being a blessing that I wasn't, 18 and I wasn't an adult. But I mention that because that was a very traumatic experience, but that kind of animated my interest in criminal justice issues. I had gotten accepted to Berkeley, but I wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to graduate from high school. I got suspended from school. My graduation was potentially going to be impacted. I managed to navigate all that and then enroll at Berkeley in the fall through some luck and some persistence. And then when I got to Berkeley, I joined the public defender's office as the cannabis lead. And so, what I was doing there was defending students that were accused of nonviolent cannabis violations by the university. So my own personal experience with that arrest animated my interest in public defense and criminal justice issues. So I did that for 4 years, and that was honestly actually a really good way to make friends when you're defending them when they're accused of cannabis crimes and you can get them off. And then after that, Raymond, I went directly to law school at Harvard, as you mentioned. And there, again, my focus was the war on drugs, which is really quite unusual. And so I designed my own kind of curriculum around criminal justice and cannabis legalization issues, and got to work with some really eminent race and criminal justice scholars when I was in law school, a couple of whom I'll mention because they both are iconic Americans that recently passed away. So just to highlight them really quickly. One was a gentleman by the name of Charles Ogletree, longtime Harvard law professor, famously was a mentor to Michelle and Barack Obama when they were in school there. I worked with him to write a paper on the racially discriminatory impact of cannabis prohibition. He actually passed away just a couple of years ago, so I was really lucky to work with him. And then another person that was really important to me is a woman by the name of Lonnie Guinair. She was the first Black woman to receive tenure at Harvard Law School. She was one of my professors, and she taught a very famous class called Law and Social Movements. And a lot of it was oriented around drug policy. And I bring this up, Raymond, because you and I are involved in a social movement right now, right? Even if we're business people, I think we're ultimately involved in a social movement. So she was a really inspiring woman. I mean, she's famous for being one of the great lawyers in the NAACP history, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So she also, passed away a couple of years ago. So that's all a way of saying that arrest animated my interest in these issues, which I expressed at Berkeley. And then I went on to Harvard, and then I studied those issues under these great scholars and got to do a lot of writing there. And, the year I graduated from law school was actually the same year, 2012, that Colorado and Washington legalized cannabis, adult use cannabis for the first time. And so I was paying attention to those issues, but I still didn't have the idea that I could work in the industry. Even though we saw those first two states come online, it didn't seem realistic. And so I did, a couple different things, as you mentioned, right before I started working in cannabis about a decade ago. And those two things were McKinsey and Airbnb. And we can dive deep on those, kind of if you want, and I could talk about them for
kind of do. Yeah. It's obviously I find business fascinating. So yeah, McKinsey, and we'll get to Airbnb because I think there's such a connection to cannabis and Airbnb where some people are about it, we're making money, it's a business model, and other people in the community are just at large are I don't know that we should allow that to happen. But now here we are 15 years later, Airbnb completely normalized, or 20 years later. But before then, McKinsey. So yeah, I remember being on working with the McKinsey team, and it was originally our first project was, why is our cash not, where it should be based on our sales numbers? And so then you have to figure out what's, where the issue is. And then once we've solved that issue of sales are here, but our cash never seems to catch up to it, then you find the issue, but then it's why did that issue happen? And the second project. So I find that very interesting. But that was just my limited experience, but just, elaborate a little bit on who is McKinsey? What do they do? Why do business nerds think that it's an interesting company? And then just, kind of what lessons did you learn from them that you could take forward in your career?
Totally. Yeah, there's so much to be said here. I would say the first thing is, I ended up working at McKinsey because they came to our law school, and everyone else I knew was going to become corporate lawyers, right? And I was everyone's becoming a corporate lawyer. That sounds boring. Maybe I don't want to do that. And so that kind of just impulse, it wasn't really thought through, is what led me to McKinsey, because I thought I would be exposed to just a broader set of ideas and skill sets by working there than being a traditional lawyer, which turned out to be true. And what I would say, if I'm being honest, Raymond, there's really a couple of different ways I could characterize this. I could highlight all of the good things about McKinsey and its virtues and what I learned there. And then I could also highlight some of the reasons I'm skeptical of it as an institution. And
give us a taste of both. Give us a taste of both. We're in the tree of trust, Hirsh. I like to keep it real on this podcast.
Totally.
And, 'cause I was a CPA too. Everybody thinks that's the end all be all. I'm oh no. Trust me, there's a reason the smart CPAs go on into operations and businesses. But yeah, tell me a little bit the good, the bad, the ugly.
Totally. I'll tell you all about it. I mean, and first, just to answer your question for people that don't know, like McKinsey is just like a very large management consulting firm, right? Like they're, one of the leading management consulting firms out there, along with Bain and BCG. They've been around for like 100 years. They pioneered the principles of like scientific management. So basically, for those that don't know, McKinsey is a long-standing advisor to the Fortune 500, to American business in every sector. And their job, as you kind of pointed out, is to solve problems that these companies are seem to be incapable of solving themselves. And their reach is so wide, right? Like more than 100 offices in a bunch of different countries. What's interesting is that McKinsey, like their philosophy is to hire people, not necessarily that have like deep business experience and expertise, but people that they perceive to be smart problem solvers, right? That's kind of the premise of the way that they hire, right? I mean, that's what they think and that's what they say. So, I mean, on the one hand, Raymond, when I got this job at McKinsey, I was excited because there was a certain kind of like stature associated with being selected by McKinsey. But at the same time, if we're being honest, like McKinsey hires a lot of people that are smart, often that are young, that don't have a ton of business experience. So if you think about someone like me, right? Like, yeah, maybe by some markers, I was a smart guy. I went to Berkeley, I got a philosophy degree, went to Harvard, got a law degree, but I didn't have any business experience. And so, if I'm being honest, in my couple years at McKinsey, part of it was exciting because every 3 months I was thrown into a new project, right, into the pharmaceutical sector or into the finance sector. And as a young person, getting exposure to a lot of those people and institutions was incredibly educational, right? And so I got to work for pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, right? Like Suka Pharmaceuticals, right? Like I got to work for banks like Citibank. For my public sector project, like I got to work for, what was then President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, which was led by Jeff Immelt, who was then the CEO of GE, right? So on the one hand, it was really cool because as a person in my young 20s, I got exposure to like really prominent institutions and leaders. And I think just by virtue of like being immersed in those spaces, you pick up a lot of things by osmosis. So that part of it was super cool. But if I'm being honest, throughout my time there, I had a feeling of imposter syndrome, right? And what I mean by that is like often I was, called upon to opine about how we can improve business processes and industries that I had no familiarity with, right? Like whatsoever. Like, I did a project for NASCAR about how NASCAR could try to obtain a larger Latino audience. And I just, I like sports, but I didn't know anything about NASCAR. And so I guess one comment I will make about McKinsey is that one of the great things that it did for me was it gave me exposure to a variety of different industries at a young age where I learned a lot in the process. But one insecurity I had throughout my time at McKinsey is that I felt that I was a smart person, but I was often giving advice to people twice my age about how to solve business problems that they were immersed in for 20 years. And like you made a good point, Raymond, where you said, hey, like maybe someone from an outside perspective can give us a new lens on these things. But that is something that I was dealing with for a while. And I guess I would say one of the reasons that I enjoy my work in cannabis now is I feel like I actually know what I'm talking about, right? Like I don't pretend to be the smartest person in the world, but this is all that I do. This is all that I pay attention to. So there's real subject matter expertise there. And a couple more things I'll say. One of the other things that
really interesting.
Yeah. The other thing that I enjoyed about it was just being immersed in different business environments. And as I mentioned earlier, now I basically run a consulting firm. And one of the things that I really enjoy about it is that I get to work with a variety of different actors, right? Like I work with a retailer, I work with a manufacturer, work with a testing lab, people with different like academic backgrounds and all of these different competencies and institutions of different sizes operating in different states. Like what I love about my work now is that there's so much like just interesting stuff that is different that I get to be involved with. And that's one of the things that I enjoyed about McKinsey, right? Rather than doing one job, like as I mentioned, working for NASCAR and Citibank and Pfizer and the US federal government are all quite different. And so that's maybe another point that I'll make is it gave me an appetite for like solving different kinds of problems. And then a few more things I'll say, and then I'll pause because I could go on for a long time. I think one of its other virtues is even though there are some people sitting in those McKinsey seats that are asked to solve problems where they don't have expertise, one of the things they were good at was attracting talent, right? Like a lot of these people, even if they didn't have business experience, were very smart. And so it allowed me to situate myself in an environment with a lot of like very competent and like driven people. And I think that by osmosis tends to have benefits. It was very similar to my time when I was at Harvard Law School, when I was like, yeah, all these people are like really smart. And just by virtue of being around them, even if they're smarter than me, right? Like I benefit a lot there. And then a couple more things I'll say, and then we can dive deeper on this if you'd like. One of the other things that McKinsey taught me is it gave me exposure to the pharmaceutical sector for the first time. And I was really turned off by what I saw, right? And I've named some of the some pharmaceutical companies I've mentioned before. Like, it would be my job to help these companies, for example, navigate different regulatory requirements and kind of like map out how they're going to navigate regulations in all of these different countries with these different authorities and get their drugs to market. And I would read about the side effects associated with some of these pharmaceutical drugs, right? And so it engendered a deep kind of skepticism. And the pharmaceutical partners at McKinsey were making so much money. And so I understand there's a role for pharmaceutical medicine, but if I'm being honest, I got really turned off by the pharma sector, given my exposure to it and given how much McKinsey serves those operators. And the other anecdote I'll just share there, Raymond, is I already mentioned how I got in trouble once when I was in high school. When I was at McKinsey, like, I would consume cannabis, right? Like in my off hours. And there was one instance in which, we were required to be drug tested for one of the projects we were doing. This wouldn't always be the case, but sometimes like really fancy banks would be like, hey, okay, we're hiring McKinsey, but everyone on the team needs to be drug tested. And this would probably not be the case today, but this was what Citibank was doing in the year 2013. And when I told one of my senior, and I was a good performer at McKinsey, but when I told one of my senior partners that I would not be able to pass that drug test, I was admonished really severely. And I remember being a younger person in my early 20s, being more idealistic and seeing the contradiction between us serving these pharmaceutical companies that in practice would harm a lot of people, even if they were intended to help some people. And that people would find my cannabis use really alarming. And so I could say more, but I'll kind of pause there about my
No, I appreciate the insight. And it is very interesting, kind of just these management consulting companies. And I feel like everybody has a little bit of imposter syndrome when they're starting out in their career, but I feel for you guys being tasked for just like, that's all that you do. Because as CPAs inherently, to do an audit or file taxes, like, you are talking with usually the C-suite, the investors at like a very early stage in your career. And so you just kind of get comfortable talking with these people. But there's always that era of like, man, I got to go ask this guy a question, and he's been doing this business for as long as I've been alive.
Yeah, totally.
So no, it's very a real thing. But moving forward a little bit to Airbnb, and I appreciate kind of just the insight into the consulting world. I'm definitely working with different companies in different states, in different markets. It's very useful for the cannabis industry because we're growing it for the first time right now, and we're opening up new markets and solving new problems. And what works here doesn't always work there. So just being willing to solve problems, I think, like that lends itself really useful here. But Airbnb. So I remember back in the day when it was starting to become more common. I'm from rural Wisconsin originally, but it was like not loved right away. They were like, it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. And at that point, I was used to traveling around the world and using like booking.com and any weird ways to find hostels and whatnot and local people to let me stay long-term at their place. So Airbnb like solved the real problem. But my question was specifically like, what was it like working at Airbnb in the earlier days where it was like upsetting some people, but making investors and other people money and commerce and, becoming a viable solution for people? So I feel like we're dealing with that a little bit in cannabis where like a state legalizes, but then some cities don't. And then they got to like coax the cities along to get them to open up and let us do business in their municipalities. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about Airbnb and what that was like dealing with the birth of this new service, business, industry that was loved by some, but not by all?
Totally. I mean, yeah, Raymond, honestly, Airbnb was one of the coolest jobs, maybe the coolest job that I've ever had, one of the most fulfilling. It prepared me really well for cannabis, and I'm excited to kind of like unpack the analogs between Airbnb and cannabis with you. But honestly, it was a really incredible, informative, experience in my career. And to be honest with you, Raymond, I just got super lucky, by which I mean, I mentioned to you that I grew up in the Bay Area, right? So I grew up in the Bay, went to college in the Bay, and then I spent this time on the East Coast, right? I went to Harvard, so I was living in Boston for a few years, and then I was living in New York City working for McKinsey. And so through the first half of my 20s, I was like on the East Coast, and I had this desire to come home, right? And like come back to San Francisco, where like all my friends were like working in tech, right? And we're doing, we're part of this new like Silicon Valley boom. And honestly, Raymond, I got super lucky, which is to say, like, I got a job at Airbnb at the perfect time, right? Where like the overwhelming number of employees were engineers and were technical hires. And Airbnb was at the first moment where kind of like what you were saying, Raymond, like there was starting to be some pushback from different stakeholders and government officials. And there was starting to be regulation kind of like built around this industry for the first time. And so I was hired by Airbnb, again, not because I'm some deep political genius, but just because I was the right guy at the right time that had some kind of like policy and and business background. And they hired me to kind of help build out their policy team. And so that's what I did at Airbnb for 4 like really formative years. When I joined Airbnb, I think there was still less than 1,000 employees, right? By the time I left Airbnb, there was more than 5,000 employees. And I left right before the IPO, for example, to join Cannabis. And so I wasn't there, in the earliest days, but I feel like I was there when it grew up to become like a real company. And that was dealing with these regulatory issues. And again, I could talk about this for so long, but it was fascinating to be part of a company that was experiencing hypergrowth. And I think cannabis has in an uneven way experienced hypergrowth as well, but it was really exciting to be part of something that was growing. Number 2, Raymond, it was exciting to be part of something, and this is, I think, the stage that cannabis is in now, that is growing across the world. So Airbnb, just like cannabis, right? Just like the cannabis industry, kind of started as a US phenomenon, but then began to spread kind of across the world. And I feel like the same thing is happening in cannabis, right? So it was exciting to be a part of that. And then the other thing, Raymond, is like my job was to build like legal and regulatory requirements and laws around Airbnb at the local level. Like it was my job to interface with government officials to build a legal and regulatory framework around this new activity called home sharing, and to help pass a law that our business could live with. And so that was a lot of my work, right? Working with the city of San Francisco, working with the city of Chicago, working with the city of New Orleans. And as time went on, it began to be working with other countries. Like I got to move to Japan and live in Japan and legalize Airbnb there by working directly with like the Japanese tourism agency. And what I learned there was that I had an appetite for understanding cultural context around the world. Like I'm not Japanese, I don't speak Japanese, but for whatever reason, I can do enough to put myself in the shoes of like that kind of culture. So being kind of a culturally literate citizen and imagining how cultures exist around the world and knowing just enough about their governments such that you can have a meaningful conversation with them about how they should regulate this activity. And so, again, I could talk about this for a while, but it was such a treat to work all across the world for 4 years, negotiate those policy agreements. And kind of like you alluded to, my job, again, similar to cannabis, was to pass legalization laws, ideally that would enable a business to succeed, right? So to legalize and legitimize the business, but to build a regulatory framework that allows that business to succeed economically. And then also, as you kind of alluded to manage all of the different stakeholders associated with it, right? So like Airbnb, there would be homeowners, there would be neighbors, there would be politicians, right? There would be the hotel lobby, right? There would be all of these, affordable housing groups. And so my job was to think about all of those different stakeholders. And I think, again, that's really quite similar to cannabis.
That is really interesting, because people forget, like, because we live in the world of zoning and like, all right, we got to get a license for this type of license type. Okay, it can be zoned here. New York just had like their hiccup up with the zoning laws. So for those who don't live in this weird world of licensing and zoning, Airbnb was unique because you have residential areas and commercial areas, and it allowed us to take a residential house and turn it into a commercial business. We wouldn't like call it that in the early days, but we were making, homeowners were making money. So like, to your point, it's confliction with the stakeholders. It's like there are jealous neighbors who are like, wait, why are there people coming and going? They're making how much money? No, that is over there in the commercial area where there's hotels, and do it over there. And so to your point, to have to deal with some of these different stakeholders is a very unique thing that was like part of the history. And then to your point, it was almost like it happened so quickly, there wasn't even regulation around it. And then to your point, they started pushing back. They're like, no, we're not going to let this become just an Airbnb neighborhood. Like, we can only have X amount. And so from that perspective, and I think about it out of the state and local level, but where do you think are you more impactful, or is like lobbying or political focus more impactful? Like, is it at this federal level, the state level, the local level? Like, obviously all three matter, but if we were just thinking through the lens of cannabis, like where should people put their efforts into like driving the industry forward for their ability to do business?
Yeah. If I think about my work in these two industries, I would describe cannabis like half of my work is at the state level and half of it is at the municipal level. But in Airbnb, like 90% of the work was at the municipal level and 10% of it was at the state level. So the way that Airbnb played out, you're basically dealing with the city, right? The city like is basically going to govern, right? Like San Francisco is going to have its own set of laws. The suburbs are going to have their own set of laws. And so Airbnb involved building a lot of close relationships with cities. And again, Raymond, it's just like so funny how life works out, right? Like it was because I passed the Airbnb regulations in LA, right? So 10 years ago, right around the time that Prop 64 is being passed in California, I passed the Airbnb regulations in LA, the first ever laws. And that's why MedMen ended up reaching out to me, because MedMen, was then the hottest company in LA. And so I guess that's a way of saying those relationships, right, with local officials, right? Some of the same officials that I dealt with to pass Airbnb ordinances were the same folks that I was later dealing with to work on cannabis legalization bills. So it's funny how that worked out. But to answer your question, I think of cannabis as like half state, right? Half local, right? A state, as we know in cannabis, has to authorize cannabis activity, and cities after that kind of take the next step about whether to kind of opt in. Whereas Airbnb was a little different, right? Like the state permission structure was less important because, as you were kind of alluding to, Airbnb and Uber, kind of unlike cannabis, on some level flaunted the laws and then forced the laws to catch up with them. Whereas cannabis, by virtue of its like historical stigma and its deep criminalization, doesn't really have that same latitude to just be like, oh, we're going to build an industry and we hope the laws catch up with us later. And so that's kind of the difference. The other thing that I'll just say is that one of the cool things about both of these jobs is I'm really passionate about both of these products. That's made this an amazing experience. Like before I worked at Airbnb, Raymond, when I was working at McKinsey in New York, I would be traveling a lot for consulting. And so this was like when Airbnb was in its super early days, like 2011, 2012, 2013, when it was, again, like really unregulated. And I would make a ton of money by renting out my apartment in the Lower East Side in New York City when I was off on these consulting gigs. And so both I think you and I are about the same age. I'm of the generation that would really use Airbnb as a guest and then as a host. And so before and was really passionate about their ability to improve the world, quite frankly. And so it was nice then to be a part of legitimizing those operations that I believe are good for the world. So.
No, that's really awesome. And it is a good segue into kind of like the global side of cannabis, because Airbnb, like I was, to let you know, like I just came back from Argentina, Buenos Aires, Uruguay, and Chile, Santiago, and we just had Airbnbs at each one. It was very smooth. It's, you could just book it in advance, it's there, you fly in, you get there, but it was super easy. I was like, okay, like I remember like very early times using Airbnb and like, all right, I like booking.com more. I'm used to that. But now it's just like Airbnb is in, every major city. It's kind of nice. Like we'll be in Berlin next month. It's like, I know a few of my friends they booked an Airbnb because they just prefer to have that home feel. They're like, I can't stay in a hotel for a whole week. So no, it's very interesting how it's going global, but cannabis is also going global. We're in our own little worlds in America and the United States, no import, no export, and even state to state, there's no import, no export between the states, but that's not the case for the rest of the world, for any, major governments that have legalized. So I guess just kind of taking let's start with like a big picture and then get in more detail, but big picture, the global cannabis opportunity, just for those kind of who don't know, can you just kind of catch people up to date on specifically the UK and EU and kind of what is going on across the pond with global cannabis? And I guess the connection from Canada to there, because it's all kind of one supply chain.
Totally. And here again, Raymond, there's like so much we could say here. I think the global.
Yeah, I know that was a very broad question.
But it's a great question. But there's so many different exciting angles that you can talk about this from, right? And it's a really cool and interesting topic. And some of the things I'm going to say are going to be probably obvious to you and your audience, but first, I think you can say now, cannabis is truly a global industry right now, by which I mean like there are meaningful cannabis economies that are developing across the world. I guess that's kind of the first premise, right? And so just to pick out a few examples, although there are many such examples, I think most people would point to Germany. You and I will both be in Germany in April, which is really exciting. We're about to hit the 2-year anniversary of when Germany adopted its medical program. So it adopted its medical program in April of 2024. So we're about to hit the 2-year anniversary in April of 2026. Okay. As you probably know, Raymond, there's now about 1 million registered medical cannabis patients in Germany, which is a lot, right? In a country of 85 million people, when you have 1 million people that are officially signed up with the government within 2 years as a medical cannabis patient, that's remarkable. And I bet, Raymond, if you and I are talking in 2 years, I bet that number is more like 2 million or 3 million. So it's cool to see the level of patient adoption in Germany. Maybe just to stick on Germany for a second, Germany historically is a very like alcohol and beer centric culture. So the adoption.
Yeah, it's like Wisconsin.
It's like Wisconsin. Yeah. I mean, and I think, you know this better than I do probably, but I think there's a lot of German immigrants, right, who ended up settling in Wisconsin, right? So yeah, I got to spend more time, by the way, in upstate Wisconsin. We can talk about that some other time during the summer. But I love the upper Midwest is where it's at, man. So that's what's super cool about Germany, right? The level of adoption there. To state the obvious, Germany is just like a very serious country, right? Like this is a country that's known for, just being like a serious country that goes through deliberative, like kind of political processes. So Germany's really exciting. I'll mention a few others kind of like quickly on the international scene, although there's many we could talk about. I think the other one is Australia, right? So Australia, along with Germany, has had a medical program that is growing in a very robust fashion for the past couple of years. So that's another big market. There's obviously Canada. We're about to hit the 8-year anniversary of Canada having a fully fledged like adult use market. So those are 3 big countries that have opted into cannabis. You mentioned the UK as well. The UK has actually technically had a medical program since 2018, but the way that it was rolled out, Raymond, was like super, super restrictive. I would analogize the UK to like a state like Georgia in the US that has like had a medical program for 10 years, but it was passed and it was extremely restrictive. And like as the years go on, it's liberalized a little further. So 7 or 8 years after the UK has passed its medical cannabis program, you're finally starting to see patient registration kind of like uptick. And then, Raymond, there are a couple other, countries that I'll mention that are, there's a few more that I'll mention quickly. Poland also has a robust like medical cannabis program. The Czech Republic just passed a law that as of this past January liberalizes their programs. 2 countries that people are watching a lot this year are Spain and France that don't really have programs now, but will adopt kind of limited programs. And so obviously I mentioned all that quickly. We don't probably have time to do a deep dive on any of those countries. But I think what that illustrates, Raymond, is that like this is happening in a lot of different places and also in places like South America as well, right?
I say like Latam has a few countries. Like we were just in like Chile had a medical program. I'm pretty sure Argentina had one.
Yeah.
Uruguay as well. There was like you would smell it everywhere. And I'm like, okay, like they're definitely taking advantage of their medical program. So Colombia and Brazil are kind of coming up in their own ways. And so Latam, you have EMEA, you have North America. Africa is definitely, cultivating. There's some big investments going on in South Africa there. So Australia, it's like, no, it's for sure global at this point. It's in Thailand. It's like, no matter how you cut up the world, for people who think about like global business, it's like, oh no, it's definitely supply chains are globalizing. I appreciate the quick kind of touch base of them. And then even like to your point, even when they're medical, like as we've learned in the States, like the medical goes for a few years, that usually tends to lead to adult use. And that tends to grow a lot quicker as well. It's just the nature of the industry. So that kind of is very interesting. So I guess kind of thinking about these different countries, can we talk a little bit about importing and exporting? Just because I think that's a topic where people in the know are like, wow, we are really, hands tied behind our backs in the United States. Like we can't even cross. We're so used to it. We're like, don't worry about country import exports. I just want to be able to go from California to New York or Missouri to Florida. But can you talk a little bit about the global supply chains and kind of how does it work? Where does it start from? What are some of the major buyers and just kind of the legalities of it? Because I think people still kind of struggle in the United States of like, wait, people can just ship weed between countries? It's like
totally. No, fascinating. And you did a really good job of laying out some of those other countries as well, right? Like, there's so many of them. Ghana is another one that just passed a medical program, so it's everywhere. And yeah, I mean, the import export thing is really fascinating. And here, I think everything I'm saying is going to be obvious, but I think maybe the first thing to note is that Canada, right, is like the leading exporter of cannabis around the world. And I think the reason that's relevant is that shows the first mover advantage that they have had by legalizing like adult use cannabis 8 years ago, right? So Canada was the first to legalize. I think the Canadian industry was kind of a mess for the first few years. And so no one really thought that Canada was obtaining some deep advantage. But now with the distance of 8 years, like we can say, one of the benefits that Canada has had of being an early mover is that it is the primary exporter of cannabis like all across the world. So I think the reason that's worth pointing out is that like the Canadian industry has been a huge beneficiary of the development of an international supply chain. And in particular, a lot of the excess product that had been depressing prices in Canada is now shipped to places like Germany and Australia. And so there's now an outlet for those products. So not only does that benefit the Canadian companies that are exporting, but that also benefits people in Canada that are not participating internationally because that's buoyed prices in the past couple of years by removing the excess supply. And kind of like your question implied, Raymond, right? Imagine a world in which Oregon or Colorado could unload its excess supply, right, to other countries. So first, like props to Canada. They moved early. They're reaping the benefits. Number two, it shows you how like the development of an international market can in turn impact a domestic market as well, which is obvious, but is interesting to think about because we normally think about these as siloed markets. The other thing I will say is like, some people might say like, oh, in the US, we grow way better weed than Canada. Like we're America, right? But one of the benefits of Canada going earlier is like they have been able to affix their cultivation facilities to like robust international EU GMP standards, right? And so those standards are a critical part. Like the German regulator is only going to accept product that meets like certain standards, right? That's just kind of like how Europe administers its medicinal processes. And so I guess Canada is like kind of like challenging the assumption that everyone in the world like will want California cannabis in a world of international commerce. They're showing that like investment in like quality processes and certifications are really necessary in order to compete on the international market. And then maybe, again, I think there's so much that could be said about this import-export topic. And by the way, like there's really cool data that you can look at internationally that you can Google pretty easily and see like, okay, like what percentage of the cannabis being consumed in Germany and Australia is from Canada and what percentage of it is from Portugal, et cetera, with Canada being the dominant provider. And I guess I bring that up to say, if you look at a map like that, then you will truly see what you and I are talking about right now, Raymond, which is like all of the exporters and all of the importers of cannabis around the world. It crystallizes how it's a truly global industry. But perhaps the latest thing I'll say is the development of an international supply chain has a legitimizing effect, which is to say, to the extent that, this is a commodity that countries around the world, and not just countries, but often like Western democratic, like more liberal leaning, like less autocratic countries are embracing, it kind of like, destigmatizes cannabis because it shows like all these other countries that are quite similar to the United States, right, are embracing this. And you can't just, say that this is something for stoners, like this is truly a global commodity. So there's the legitimizing effect. And then maybe the last thing I'll say, Raymond, is, as your question implied, Canada is the beneficiary of this international supply chain. The United States can't even ship its cannabis like in an interstate way across its country. Regardless of your own politics, like we have a president right now that, reinforces this America First philosophy. There is nothing less America First, right, than allowing the international cannabis market to be dominated by Canadians as Americans are unable to avail themselves of those markets. So it exposes a contradiction in the way we're ceding our advantage to other countries on this. So
no, that is, it just made me think of another quick question because it is interesting, like regardless of politics, it's like the President Trump has like kind of taken that stance. He's obviously made some, executive order back in December. So I guess like Schedule 3, if it happens, if it doesn't happen, some people would argue it's just a matter of when. But I guess like how would Schedule 3 impact, like if it does get rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, how would that impact international import exports? Or at least interstate commerce in the USA. I know we're kind of shifting gears a little bit, but I guess just what are your thoughts on S3?
Yeah, so here on that specific question you asked, right?
Yeah, just this.
There are some companies that believe that Schedule 3 will give them the ability to ship their product that meets certain medical standards to international markets, right? And I think the best example of this is Glass House, and I bring them up only because they put out like a press release on this, right? So there's some companies like Glass House, a really big cultivator in California, who have put out press releases saying that rescheduling will give them potentially the ability to, even though they can't ship products interstate, they can ship products that meet certain medical standards to international markets. And what they're suggesting is that if you obtain like the necessary DEA registration license, then you can engage in international commerce through that license. I think that sounds plausible, but I'll be honest, like I just don't think we have enough information to say that for sure. Maybe that's true. Right. But I do think there's still so much ambiguity about how the mechanics of this will work. And I will also say that this is dependent upon the behavior of other actors. Right. I mean, just in theory, if the German regulator, for whatever reason, said that this product doesn't meet their standards, then a U.S. cultivator wouldn't be able to ship there without their acceptance. So I know it's not a super clear answer to your question, but I think the answer is there are some parties that are eagerly anticipating how Schedule 3 will, in their mind, allow themselves to avail themselves of international markets. But at least for someone like me, like I'm still trying to figure out the mechanics of how that would work in practice. And so I still think that's a little bit uncertain on that specific question. Yeah. is what I would say.
No, that totally makes sense. We get the question all the time, being CPAs, so we get it on the tax side, but then also managing the money and the capital of these companies. It's like the investors want to know, the owners want to know. But I agree with you. It's there's too much ambiguity. At a minimum, yes. So 280E goes away, so more free cash flow that instead of paying it in taxes, we'll have it to, in theory, pay back investors, bring on new investments, support, further expansion. But that's pretty much like all we know for sure is that 280E will go away, which in theory should lead to it, should be a positive catalyst for capital.
Yep.
Here's a little bit back to the global scene. Because can you talk a little bit about the differences between medical and adult use? And I know there's plenty of experts out there on the global scene. I'm going to be talking to a couple of them over the next few weeks here, but just to your points, I agree with you. Like, Germany is a very, there's German engineering. It's a fairly buttoned up culture that's very regimented, and they do their analysis. It's, they're not going to make big swings in, social policy. And so I think it is like a leader of like, oh, if they figured it out, like that makes a lot of sense. There's like 80 million people, where Canada, of course, it's great, but they, it's like a G7 or G6 nation went adult use, but it's, slightly smaller. It's about the size of California. Everybody lives in Toronto. So it's like a little bit more like, I would say, like, thought process is a little bit easier to manipulate or influence, but Germany is just one of those like interesting ones being in Europe. So I guess just from that perspective, kind of how is German what is the difference in their medical and adult use? And could you explain how the German clubs work?
Totally.
Their adult use. I kind of think of it as like California, where it's like at one point California was known as like, oh, you just got to go to, California, get your med card. Like, you just got to go to the correct med card doctor, the weed doctor. The dispensary will literally probably be connected to their doctor office, just for like cliche, visions of California. Germany, obviously that's not the case, but can you just talk a little bit about like its expansion in their medical program, how it has evolved with the telehealth medical aspect of it, and then kind of where their adult use program stands, because it is kind of like the evolution.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, so the first thing I'll say is like, we'll talk about Germany in a second, but there's so many different flavors of medical programs around the world. I would analogize it to a Raymond, like, how in the US we have a bunch of different medical states, but like you could have a state like Florida, which is medical, but it's basically a quasi adult use program, right? And then you could have a state like Georgia,
like
which is like Texas, right? Exactly, right? Where it's like super restrictive form factors. So the same variety of medical programs we see in the States, you also see across Europe. Like, I was reading something that said that like 21 of the 27 EU countries have a medical program, but like they vary dramatically in what that looks like. So maybe that was obvious, but I think that's the first thing to note over there. The second thing I would say is like the medical programs in Europe generally, like whereas in the US, I see the medical programs as kind of a Trojan horse, right, for adult use legalization eventually. I don't quite think of the European programs that way. Like, Europe seems to have been more disciplined about taking their quote unquote medical programs and allowing them to mimic like their existing medical infrastructure, right, and providers. And so to stick on Germany, right, like Germany has a medical program. But what does that mean, Raymond, right? Like, that means that you can go to many doctors in Germany, right? And then you can get a medical cannabis prescription. But that medical cannabis is distributed through pharmacies. And so I think that's one thing that's important to note, right? Like, unlike the US, where we'll legalize cannabis in a state, we'll set up our own bespoke distribution network, right? A dispensary is like infrastructure that we create to distribute cannabis and only cannabis. In Germany, what they do is they say, okay, like just like any other pharmaceutical product, now you can obtain cannabis products through the pharmacy, right? And so I think you see that theme in Europe of how like their medical cannabis programs are situated within their existing healthcare systems instead of just being like this other system that's distinct from it. And again, I would point out, like, you go to pharmacies where you can buy any other kinds of medicines and cannabis as well. So I think that's one thing worth noting. A couple other things I'll say on that, Raymond. What's interesting is a lot of these pharmacies in Germany have been struggling economically for various like reimbursement reasons, and many of them have found cannabis to be a boon. So I think that's actually quite interesting. Like, pharmacies in Germany that have leaned into medical cannabis have benefited economically. And the analogy I would make that maybe is familiar to you, Raymond, since like you're from the upper Midwest, and the same way I read about like breweries in Minnesota who were struggling, who then opted into like hemp beverages and found that to be a really good product line, right? Like, it's actually similar to like pharmacies in Germany who are struggling and then adopted this additional product category that is really serving where consumer demand is and are seeing that as a boost. So I think that's interesting. The other thing, Raymond, again, just to kind of flesh out this medical program here, like in Europe, like health care is subsidized by the government. So a lot of these products, right, like it is cheaper to buy weed in pharmacies in Germany than it is to buy it illicitly. So really think about that. In the US, it's always cheaper to buy your weed on the street, basically, right? But in Germany,
insurance isn't covering any medical cannabis in the United States. No
it's
insurance
not.
is covering
It's not. And again, that's why this is so exciting, because you're right, Raymond, it doesn't. But I bet a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, they're going to be like, wait a minute, why do Germans have their medical cannabis covered and we in the US don't? That's the benefit of these different models around the world, is it allows us to ask more critical questions, right, about how we're administering things. But yeah, I mean, as you said, insurance doesn't cover cannabis in the US. And so I think it is pretty wild that not only do you walk into a pharmacy, right, to buy your cannabis in Germany, but also you're likely buying it at a cheaper price, right, than you would be able to buy it on the street, because it's subsidized by the government. And if the goal of this was mitigating the illicit market, then that's a good thing. And just quick sidebar, I'll tell you, Raymond, back to the idea this is a global industry. When the German Bundestag, they have a committee called the Health Committee, right? So in 2022, right, almost exactly 4 years ago now, the German Bundestag visited California before they passed their law, to go on a tour of California to learn about cannabis, right, before they passed their law in late 2023. And I actually was lucky enough, right? They're like, oh, we want to talk to California policy experts. So I was lucky enough to get to tour around the state of California with a dozen members of the German Bundestag. And I'm not saying the conversations they had with me or whatever changed their minds, but one of the things that we impressed upon them was how ineffective California was at mitigating the illicit market. And Germany still has an illicit market problem, but it's cool to see that on a price basis, they have taken steps to mitigate that illicit market. So
that's the way to beat them. You got to outsell them. You got to outsell the illicit market to beat them. You can really only do that if prices and quality is
price and quality. So price and quality, right? But then I think you can. And obviously I think in California we have, in my opinion, failed on both of those dimensions, quite frankly. But that's how the medical program has a different flavor than the US. And then on the social clubs, it's interesting, right? Your audience may be familiar that when Germany passed its law, there was 2 pillars of its law. Right. And so pillar 1 was the medical, and pillar 2 is the adult use program. That's the language that was used when they passed this program. So pillar 1 has been implemented, right? Pillar 1 is the medical program through pharmacies that we've just been discussing. Pillar 2 basically really has not been implemented yet and has continually been delayed. And pillar 2 is the adult use component of this program. And Raymond, as you mentioned, one component of pillar 2 that is in the process of implementation are these things called social clubs, right? And so social clubs are basically like collectives where you can be a member of this collective. And if you're a member of this collective, then this collective can potentially be your source of adult use cannabis, even if you're not a medical patient. These have been slow to kind of roll out. There aren't that many social clubs around in Germany thus far. So I guess what I would say is 2 years after this law took effect, the medical program is up and running. The adult use portion of it has been kind of slow going. Part of this relates to the fact that there's a new government in Germany, and one of the partners in that government is this party called the CDU, which is Angela Merkel's historic party, which is kind of the more it's like the Republican Party, right, of Germany. And so that will, kind of getting that part of the coalition on board will be necessary to continue to take further steps. But I'm optimistic that as time goes on and cannabis becomes more normalized in Germany, then we will start to see the rollout of that kind of pillar 2 framework that will be more adult use in nature. But we're kind of going to have to wait and see exactly what it will look like. We really don't know quite yet. So
no, that makes a lot of sense. But it's it's like anything. It's you got to start somewhere, and I like to think momentum does take up speed. It's like it starts some way. And then once more people get used to it, it tends to take on a little bit more speed. But just to summarize, because I think that was a good call out of the medical programs in Europe, just like the United States, there's different medical programs. You could be in some areas where there's, to your point, very restrictive use, form uses, and then how you get your medical card. You need to have a very serious condition, whereas other states and various points in time had, you could pretty much buy flour, you could buy anything that you normally would at an adult use dispensary at the medical. But in Germany, it's a little bit more buttoned up. And I thought it was interesting too, in Europe, I was chatting with some of these pharmacy owners, and in America, we're so used to big pharma. And we're like, well, yeah, if you go to the pharmacy store, it's $1 billion big pharma company. If you're getting anything covered by insurance, $1 billion pharma company. But in Europe, I learned it's 3rd generation family pharmacy. Family pharmacies are still a thing over there. Yep. Where it's it's a 3rd generation. And I think there is some caps where they can only have 3 pharmacy locations or something. So they're not this massive multinational billion-dollar pharmacies. They're like, to your point, real business owners that open up a family pharmacy where medical cannabis has been a nice product for them to, administer through this pharmacy. But yeah, much more of a real, pharmacy based. This is where you go. You're not going to a medical dispensary. And I'm just smiling because I'm thinking of some of the early days, like medical dispensaries. And it's like, man, this does not feel like a hospital, but all right. So yeah, it's cool to see how it's like can be a little bit more buttoned up. But I think we could learn a lot from them in the States where it's like, hey, if you want this to happen a little bit faster, you got to take your medical program a little bit more serious. And to your point, like treat it like real medical products. In the United States, we pay for insurance. Insurance covers some of the medical products. Like that blew me away to learn about that in Europe of like, wow, you guys actually really do treat this like medical where it's at a pharmacy, your insurance covers it. We don't really do that in the States. So I think that was like a big takeaway from last year where I'm like, no, we should definitely take heed because I live in a state like Wisconsin, no medical, no adult use. So there's still states that for sure, like we're behind the 8 ball. And so we're worried about federal reform, which would be great because it would, accelerate a lot of the state level stuff. But yeah, we still have a lot that we could learn from Europe and vice versa. But being mindful of time, I could chat with you all day about cannabis and policy as we live in this world, but just digging up to the next 3 years because, things happen quick in cannabis, but over the next 3 years, what has you concerned about the cannabis industry and what has you excited about the cannabis industry, both domestically and abroad?
Yeah. There's a lot of things that have me concerned about the cannabis industry. I would, yeah, I mean, one, I would describe political dysfunction in the United States. Like, even though there's been a sea change in consumer attitudes in the US, in order for this industry to reach its economic expression, we're going to have to change laws. And even cannabis aside, we're living in a moment in the United States where there's deep political dysfunction. So that's one of the things. To the extent that we're relying on politicians to get things done, even though attitudes have changed, our political system is really limiting the expression of our cannabis industry. So that's one thing that has me concerned. I think another thing that has me concerned is that, like stigma is deeply embedded no matter what the issue is, and it's really easy to activate. And so when you have like unregulated cannabis products that are like really high dosage and they cause public health incidents, that reactivates the lingering stigma that exists against cannabis. Like, we really have to have our act together to roll this out in a way that does not set off alarm bells and that convinces people that are skeptical that cannabis legalization is not a threat to them and their families. So that's another thing that concerns me. Like, I have good friends of mine who will text me pictures of like 500 milligram like edibles and are like, I can't believe you guys in this. And these are friends of mine that consume cannabis that don't work in the industry. They're like, I can't believe you guys sell this stuff. And I'm like, no, dude, that's not us, right? Those are illegal products. And so when people that I know that are progressive on cannabis say that to me, that is a wake up call, and that concerns me. So those are two of the things that concern me. I mean, what makes me optimistic?
On a high note.
Totally. There's two things that make me optimistic. Domestically, we're starting to see regions of the United States really open up to cannabis that I think are exciting. I would describe Appalachia as one of them, Raymond, right? So like Ohio went online, Virginia just went online, right? The two states in between them, Kentucky, right, and West Virginia, are seeing rapidly growing medical programs. And so I'm excited for cannabis to no longer be associated with like New York and LA and Seattle as a coastal phenomenon, and for it to be understood as like a medicine, especially in parts of the country that are dealing with health and opioid related challenges. And so what's exciting about Virginia legalizing is that it pushes Appalachia forward, and then it also like opens things up in the South, the first adult use state in the South. So that's what I'm excited about domestically, is those regions of prohibition in the United States opening up, right, to legal cannabis. And then internationally, what I'm excited about, Raymond, is what we've been talking about for much of this episode, which is to say, like, when you see countries around the world embracing the same plant and putting their own like kind of cultural and regulatory spin on it, it has a deeply destigmatizing effect. And I'll just say again, like, I predict there'll be a bifurcation in countries' approach towards cannabis, whereas like more repressive autocratic regimes will continue to criminalize cannabis, like Russia and China and Iran. And then I think you will see more Western liberal countries, be it like Canada or Australia or Israel or the United States, right? All of those countries are imperfect, by the way. I'm not saying they're perfect, but
yeah, for sure.
You will see them start to embrace this. And I think that will codify the idea that cannabis is freedom, right? And this is medical freedom. And so I'm excited about that. And I'm hoping that gives people like you and me a good excuse to travel around this beautiful world for many years doing cannabis work. So,
no, you couldn't have said it any better. And I agree with you. Very interesting to see kind of who are the countries that are opening up. And I think it will become, kind of like a symbol of freedom, because you can already see it even in Latam. Like, some cultures are further along, and shocker, they're the ones that are more like Europe and the Western and embraced it. So no, I'm excited as well. And yeah, the last 10 years went by quick, so I'm excited for the next 10. But thanks again for your time and your insight, Hirsh. It's always a pleasure, and looking forward to catching up with you in person. Have a good day.
Such a pleasure to be on your podcast, Raymond. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.